Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar from A New Normal with the topic of Are privilege and unconscious bias the two most controversial terms in the world of ED&I? I'm really glad to welcome you, really honoured to be hosting this session. My name is Herbert. I'm a partner with A New Normal, with my main specialisation being in the world of coaching. Your two panelists today are Trish Driver and Julie Martins. So I'd just like, Trish and Julie, would you like to give a short introduction to yourselves?
Sure, thank you, Graham. So I'm Trish Driver. I'm the founder at A New Normal, a background of sort of 20 odd years working in and for various different corporates, doing all sorts of things people related, and founded A New Normal 4.5 years ago. We work with clients across all sectors, doing all sorts of things, everything around equality, diversity and inclusion, working with clients across all different sectors, all geographies, and doing, as I say, all things ED&I. Julie.
Thank you, Trish. Julie Martins. Very similar background, in fact, to Trish. We now obviously focus specifically in diversity, inclusion and equity, but most of my career has been people-related functions, starting in psychology, and I'm currently Director of D&I Consulting here at A New Normal.
Perfect, thank you both. And I can see as we've been doing the introductions, the numbers of participants has gradually been increasing. So for any of you that have just been joining and have missed any little bits of the introduction, don't worry, because we are recording this session, and that's important to let everyone know that we're doing that as well. So you can always go back and look at anything that you missed through the catch-up. We've also got another member of New Normal, Ryan Casey, on our call today. He's going to be moderating and monitoring the Q&A. So if you do have any questions as we go through, please use the Q&A function. Ryan will be doing the moderating and will pass them on to me, and we'll pick those up as we go through, or certainly at the end of the session. We're aiming to leave at least around 15 minutes for questions at the end, so we'll pick those up and have a little bit of a conversation. But anyway, let's make a start. So as we go into the first question, so first of all, I thought it would be useful just to get a little bit of context over the landscape we work in. So Julie, do you just want to, when we talk about diversity, equity and inclusion, do you just want to give a quick overview as to what do we mean?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Graham. We tend to do this with all the work we do because people tend to say ED&I or DE&I or diversity and inclusion like it's one word, and we want to be clear on what each piece means. So diversity is literally the state of being different, the difference. And it's much more, though, than just the protected characteristics, the characteristics protected by law. We're not going to go into all of the detail right today, the webinar, but just to say that, as I say, diversity is a state of being different. And we truly believe that the key point here is to have diversity with inclusion. So inclusion is the active part. It's making sure that people feel that they can be themselves and bring their diversity and the richness that comes with that to the table. So organizations need to be really active in making sure people are included, not just not excluded. And the E is for equity versus equality. So we believe that it's important to stress this. It's not about treating people the same. In some situations, there need to be reasonable adjustments to make the situation kind of fair. So removing barriers so that everyone has an equal experience. And these things for us mean that you can have a truly inclusive culture. And the significance, of course, is that then you get to celebrate, as we said, that richness of diversity. People thrive, the organisation benefits, individuals benefit, with that kind of, again, richness of thought and contribution that comes from different characteristics that people have and bring to the organisation.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful to get that all into context as to what the real meanings of those are and how we base that context. So let's move on to this question of the webinar. So, are privilege and unconscious bias the two most controversial terms in the world of ED&I? So Trish, what are we basing that on?
I was going to say the short answer is yes, we think they are in our experience. And I guess we're basing that on the fact that between us, Julie and I have worked in this space for probably, I don't know, 40 odd years or so experience between us. And we know that these are the topics that we really need to kind of position carefully whenever we're working with people. And I guess that's just around some of the kind of cultural connotations that go along with these terms. So I know that we'll probably talk about this in a moment, but I think, recognizing that whenever we're doing any work with either an organisation or with individuals, we have to take everybody on that journey with us. Some people are going to feel really comfortable with it. Some people are going to feel really happy talking about this. For other people, the immediate kind of cultural connotation of these two terms, privilege and unconscious bias, is going to feel a little bit challenging. And I think, we certainly see that. We always used to joke about, you mentioned the words unconscious bias, you see people's shoulders going up in a workshop. And I think, in the last couple of years, with a lot of conversation around the concept of privilege, we've certainly seen that that's probably the most emotive topic that we can talk about within a setting, whether that's a workshop, whether that's one-on-one. And I think it is really, for us, it's all about that kind of cultural context in terms of how people perceive the terms on the basis of what they see and hear in the wider world about it.
So it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about that. So you've touched on the fact that there's this difference between the actual definition of privilege and unconscious bias, the cultural context of that, and then the concept itself. Yeah. So do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, we see those three things as being really separate from one another. So you look at the kind of dictionary definitions for the terms of unconscious bias and privilege, and they're quite innocuous in and of themselves. So you look at the definition of privilege, and it's a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. And that's kind of, that doesn't feel too emotive when you look at those words in terms of the dictionary definition of it. But I think in our experience, what we tend to see is that people hear, when you talk about privilege, you're telling me that I've never experienced any hardship in my life, or that I've always had it really easy. And I think that's it's a really important piece of information to recognise, that we see that there is this kind of real emotional context bound up in it. So we hear a lot about people saying, oh, you need to check your privilege, or we've heard people talking about weaponising privilege to really kind of alienate one group from another. And I think that kind of comes down to this idea that people maybe don't kind of get to grips necessarily with what's really at the heart of the concept. And for us, we really love the definition that Rennie Edo-Lodge and John Amici share when it comes to privilege, when they talk about it as being an absence of challenge. And I think that's it's a much more helpful way of looking at it, in terms of, we're not saying that, for example, if someone has white privilege, we're not saying that nothing about their lives has ever been difficult. It's just that the colour of their skin hasn't been the cause of any of those difficulties. We really like the example that Rennie Edo-Lodge gives in her book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. She talks about kind of this absence of challenge and not kind of quite realising it until she saw it herself. So she changed her commute to work and didn't realise until she was taking a bike for her journey how inaccessible parts of her commute were. So until she physically had to handle a bike, a set of wheels, up a flight of stairs, she'd never thought about how inaccessible her commute to work was. So I think, for us, this kind of absence of challenge is really what's at the heart of that concept about privilege. And similarly with unconscious bias, you see the dictionary definition of unconscious bias being a bias that we're completely unaware of, that happens automatically and outside of our control, that's, I guess, formed on the basis of all of the experiences that we've had. So again, not really kind of controversial in terms of the words that are used to define it. But what we sometimes see is people hearing, when they hear that term unconscious bias, well, you're telling me I'm a terrible person, or I make judgments about people, and that there's something intentional about it. And I think, again, that's probably down to some of the kind of quite unhelpful narrative that we see in popular culture around it, kind of this knee-jerk reaction, put somebody on an unconscious bias course if they've done something reprehensible in the workplace, or the government's report that came out a couple of years ago saying that unconscious bias training is not worth doing. And so you see all of these pieces of cultural context pulling together to form people's perceptions of these things. And actually, when you look at what's at the heart of this concept of unconscious bias, it's that bias is really in and of itself neither inherently good nor inherently bad. It's kind of a fact of life. When we're talking about bias in the work that we do with our clients, we use a quote that we really love, which says, you're not responsible for your first thought, but you are responsible for your second thought and your first action. And for us, that's about recognizing that these immediate unconscious reactions that we have to things are completely out of our control. But the reason that it's important for us to kind of get to grips with it is because we do have control over what comes next. So I kind of think in the work that we do, we're really saying that, yes, we recognise there are these dictionary definitions, and we recognise that there is a whole load of cultural context that goes around these things, but we really just need to get over ourselves and kind of get to grips with what's at the heart of those concepts.
Yeah, no, that's really good, really great explanation. Thank you. And you say we need to get over ourselves. So, Julie, what's behind that? This concept of let's get over ourselves and get to grips with what's at the heart of these concepts.
Yeah, we say, yeah, get over ourselves, because we see time and time again in the work that we do that people, as Trish said, people feel challenged as soon as these terms are even suggested. With one client, we had to use the P word. And even then, they feel challenged, people feel challenged. They see the terms as negative, as Trish was just explaining. And I guess a natural reaction to feeling challenged often and negativity is people get resistant or even defensive. And in that, we found that can be a real blocker to having a conversation. So the work that we do with all of our clients is actually to remove the blockers to have a conversation. In fact, we start most of our workshops and facilitated discussions with be brave enough to start a conversation, because for us, it really is about this active inclusion we've talked about. And in order to have active inclusion, it's really, really beneficial to understand somebody else's perspective and appreciate somebody else's lived experiences. And in order to do that, we believe the best thing to do is have these open conversations and share experiences and be really open to hearing what somebody else says they have experienced, witnessed, felt, etc., etc. So we spend a lot of time hopefully creating really psychologically safe spaces where people do share their experiences, and we hope that we create on the flip side an environment where someone can be really open to let that negativity go, remove the blockers, and don't worry about the terms, as Tricia just said, just kind of get to grips with the context and concept and listen to what somebody's saying. And then you can be truly open to creating these inclusive cultures we've talked about. It means as an individual, we are less, I guess, afraid. So Trish made reference to unconscious bias, and it's a natural evolutionary tool that kind of protects us and keeps us safe. And as human beings, if something is unknown to us or unfamiliar, it's a bit scary or not safe. So the more we have the conversations, the more we see other people's perspectives, the less scared or afraid we are, we can then start to see things with this lens of inclusivity that we talk about often, and apply that to our day-to-day work and our day-to-day interactions, which again, creates this environment that we've referred to before, which is inclusive, which means people then can bring themselves and their opinions. And that's when the richness of diversity really gets to kind of play out, because people aren't then conforming and worrying about things. They're able to present as they are and share their views and their lived experiences and their perspectives freely.
We saw a lovely example of that playing out in a session that we ran quite recently. So we always, we talk about our, I suppose, both our biases and our privileges kind of almost form this invisible bubble around us. So within that bubble is all of our experiences and our identities and all of the different elements of our identities and the people that we know. And the reason that we think that these topics are so important is because as human beings, as Julie said, we're almost sort of predisposed to make assumptions that other people's experiences are the same as ours. And that means that we, if we're talking about an absence of exclusion versus being proactively inclusive, if we're making an assumption that everyone's experiences are the same as ours, then we're not going to be making those proactive steps to make people feel included. And we talked a lot in this session about the need to kind of think about things from different people's perspectives. And, if you're, for example, part of the LGBTQ community, sometimes people feel like they have to kind of conceal elements of their weekend because they're not comfortable talking about their lives outside of work when they're in the workplace. And we had someone come back to us in one of the sessions that we ran recently and say, I really kind of thought about that in terms of different experiences, and I ended up having this really long and in-depth conversation with someone who I knew was gay, who I was talking to in a social situation about their work and whether they kind of talked about their weekend and whether they felt comfortable being themselves. And we saw this participant talking about how he basically kind of coached this individual to say, if you don't feel like you can be yourself in the workplace, then maybe this isn't the right place for you. And I think, that's that kind of broadening of your bubble and kind of thinking about things from other people's perspectives is so important in this work, because it means that we can kind of start those conversations that we wouldn't ordinarily do just out of habit and reflex, but we can see things that might be different for other people's experiences.
Yeah, thank you. And we've talked a lot there about the kind of richness of conversation when people feel in a safe space, when people are open to having the conversations and to kind of recognize biases, etc. What I guess the challenge is for those people that aren't getting it, for those people that are being resistant, those people where, so how do we have those conversations with these very emotive topics with people that just aren't getting it or don't want to get it?
It's a really difficult one. I think I would say particularly privileged, because it does feel, I think Julia would probably agree with me, it does feel like that's more emotive maybe as a topic. And what you tend to find in most organisations is that the people at the very top of the organisation who are making all of the decisions about everything that goes on for everybody else, by very nature of the fact that they are the most senior people in organisations, are likely to hold a degree of privilege from that anyway. Typically, they'll also have more of that absence of challenge than maybe the rest of the organisation do. So, we see time and time again that organisations are less diverse at the very top level than they are in the rest of the organisation. And I think having that conversation, especially with really senior leaders, about recognising that other people's experiences may be very different to theirs, can just feel like a really touchy topic. What we would always try and do is just bring it back to that very heart of the concept. So we talked about, the kind of, I guess the core reason for understanding both of these things is to recognise that other people's perspectives on a subject may be different to yours, or that other people's journey to get to where they've got to in their career may be quite different to yours, or that someone may have already experienced kind of half a dozen microaggressions already in the morning, and you're expecting them to kind of just rock up and be smiley and cheerful and happy and comfortable in the workplace. So I think kind of for us, we always try and draw it back to that kind of, how does your experience diverge from those around you, particularly if folk are in a senior leadership position, kind of making it so that they can see that maybe their experience of life or their experience of work might be different to other people's. And we talk about it and we look at it in a number of different ways, but really it's about anything that we can do to kind of, I guess, get people to just think about maybe where their experiences diverge from other people. So kind of having people share their real life experiences is really powerful in that situation. But I think as well, kind of, if I wanted to talk to somebody about their privilege and how it was impacting their behaviour at work, I probably wouldn't use the word privilege to talk about it. I'd probably kind of draw it back to a context or a situation, and we talk about the fact that, I don't know, if you're running a recruitment process, thinking about the impact that recruitment process has on people who maybe have a completely different background to you. So, we all have a tendency to assume that everybody will have a safe, quiet, comfortable space where they could do a video interview, and will have the right clothing for this kind of things, and will have access to a stable internet connection, because those are the things that typically we would have if we're in a working environment. So just thinking about where people's experiences might diverge and what we can do to manage that is really, really important. And I think having those really tangible, practical examples is really helpful. And I think hearing people share their own personal experiences is just really so powerful in that space. I don't know, Julie, whether you'd agree with that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, a lot of the work we do is actually going in and to with our clients and doing what we call discovery work and starting these conversations. Be brave enough to start the conversation, because again, as Trish said, what we find often with maybe the leadership is that they understand the concepts intellectually. Back to what Trish said, they understand it intellectually, but it's making that connection. It's kind of almost humanizing or associating and putting emotion into the subject. And the best way to do that is, as we keep saying, understanding somebody else's perspective. And it can be a really big leap. If you understand the concept intellectually, but you have no examples, it's a bit of a leap. So actually asking your people, or, how they feel, what they think, or Trish made reference to recruitment, we're not expecting people to know absolutely everything about every permutation of every characteristic and every intersectionality and be prepared for that. That's really difficult. So it's just a question of asking people if they need anything different, asking people if they'd like to share anything, asking people if there's anything that inhibits them being really productive and really being empowered to do their best at work. And so as we keep saying, conversation. And I think the piece that we haven't touched on is that bit about if someone does then have a conversation with you, and as Trish said, we wouldn't say, we think you need to check your privilege, but if someone approaches us and wants to give us some feedback or wants to share with us something that wasn't appropriate or something that they need, seeing that as a real positive, that saying that feedback is a gift. Again, this kind of taking away that negativity and the defensiveness and all that stuff, and thinking if someone is comfortable enough and feels safe enough to share with us an experience or ask us for a reasonable adjustment, don't see that as a personal criticism, see that actually as something wonderful in that you've created an environment that they feel comfortable in sharing. And just be, open ears, and don't feel you have to solve a problem right there and there in the moment. Just be open and understanding and thank someone for sharing their perspective and work forwards with them, to whatever it is. There's so many different examples, but I think it's, as I say, it's making it less about the intellectual concept and more about human beings' feelings and experiences.
And I guess having those conversations can be quite difficult, can be quite tiring, can be quite exhausting, feeling always that there's this conversation to be had. So, it can feel like a lot. Is it, do we always have to have those conversations? Is that something that is always a requirement, do you think?
We find that the more conversation you can have, the better. But, best practice we've seen is where in truly inclusive cultures where, the setup is there, there's clear expectations of behavior, and then the conversations directly to answer your question is not kind of, we will have an inclusive conversation today. It's having regular conversations that you'd hope in organizations with your people about all aspects of their work, and just making sure that in there is something about, do you have everything you need in order to be doing your job to the best of your ability, or words to that effect. Reference again to recruitment. You don't need to necessarily to every single person say, do I need to know anything about you before you even come in? But being really clear about being actively inclusive, being really clear that if there were any reasonable adjustments required for an interview process, or even, when you join a company, just having a statement that's really clear that says to people, yes, we are inclusive and we're open to doing what we need to do to support you. So it's not, necessarily having a question every single 9 o'clock, let's have a conversation again. It's just kind of weaving it into the fabric and embedding it, as you say, to our clients, embedding inclusivity into every aspect of what you do. And that does take conversations, but the more you kind of do them, the more natural they are. And it's not a kind of a forced thing. It's just a part of how, as I say, best practice organizations work.
Yeah.
I think kind of having that environment where people do feel safe and comfortable to challenge is really, really important as well. So, one of the biggest things is kind of recognizing, this is, I guess this is part of the privilege piece as well. Sometimes we're here, well, everybody's fine. Nobody ever tells me that anything is kind of not comfortable for them or that they need anything different. And I think just kind of getting a little bit beyond that and kind of going beyond what you can see on a surface level and kind of recognizing that, maybe if it is a conversation around leadership, maybe people don't feel comfortable kind of sharing that stuff up the chain, or maybe if somebody is in some way marginalized, that they're not always going to feel comfortable calling it out if they're on the receiving end of a microaggression, or something even more than that. And I think best practice would be that anybody in any organization would feel like they can kind of share at any moment in time, actually, you just said this thing and that really made me feel uncomfortable. But the reality is, and I'm sure there'll be people listening to this who've been on the receiving end of something, you kind of, it's almost kind of that internal thing of, do I say something? Or sometimes you're so shocked that you don't want to say anything. And I think, this is where we see privilege as being a real opportunity. If you're someone who has any kind of privilege within an organisation, the best thing you can do with that privilege is use it to be a really strong ally for people around you. So if you do see something, then making sure that you step in if you see something that you think is inappropriate, because the reality is it's always going to be much harder for the person who is on the receiving end of it to say something. Julie, I feel like we've kind of touched on microaggressions quite a lot, but we haven't really kind of defined microaggression, and I know you're really good at defining it, so would you be happy to do that?
I'm actually the worst person to describe, because I personally I find the term quite emotive, full disclaimer, because I feel that these things that people say are actually often sexist, racist, homophobic, and they're described as microaggressions because they're on the surface so small that it's not something you go to HR about or call the police about, but they are comments that are ultimately discriminatory, but they're kind of often veiled or said in light conversation. We've got a brilliant video we often use as part of our anime, to use part of workshops, that shows a microaggression as like a mosquito bite. So, one mosquito bite, a little kind of not so great comment that does have maybe some discrimination behind it, but it's just a mosquito bite. But actually, I think you said earlier, Trish, 300 mosquito bites later, it's a problem. It's really, really painful. And so, yeah, I could probably talk quite a lot about that, but I think we can definitely, on our website, you can find the link I'm referring to actually in our education section about what microaggressions are. But I think you're absolutely right. It's the things that happen often on a daily basis that some people might not even realise they're saying or they're doing, and the receiver absolutely knows what's been said there and is taken offence, and it's really difficult to then how do you call that out? Not only how do you call that out in the moment to an individual, in a work situation, because you might look like you're oversensitive, you're not, but also, could you be doing that all day, every day? Microaggressions happen a lot to some people. Are you going to be kind of challenging every single person every single day? That's your question earlier, Herbie, about it becomes exhausting. The person on the receiving end can feel exhausted if they're constantly having to kind of call something out or challenge something. But it is the right thing to do, because sometimes, I guess that's supposed to be the nature of a microaggression, that the person who's doing it, delivering it, doesn't realize what they're doing. But it does once again go back to having as much conversation as possible. But as you said, Trish, I think, yeah, if you're a bystander in those circumstances, yes, please do be a really good ally, and call something out, because as we just said, the person directly affected may be mortified, or may not have learned responses in some cases to these things. You laugh it off because you can't challenge every single one, or you might get really angry because it is the 7th thing that's happened today. So actually, if someone can kind of step in or support you and be a really good ally and call something out on your behalf, I always think that's a really good thing to do.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's, sorry, Trish, carry on.
I was just going to say, I think, that's the kind of other byproduct of privilege, that you haven't had the chance to kind of recognise in yourself, that you won't necessarily see those microaggressions for how damaging they are. because again, in your world, in your little bubble, well, it's just a joke or it's just banter, and it shouldn't, it shouldn't have a negative impact on anybody because it doesn't have a negative impact on you. And I think, that's, when people say check your privilege, that's kind of what's at the core of it is, is your life experience the same as this person's, or actually is it completely different? And I think having a real awareness of our own privileges is just so important. We've seen it in the last couple of weeks, and I think for me it really brought it home for me with the killing of Chris Cabba in London by a police officer a couple of weeks ago. And I feel like because of the kind of coverage that we've seen, or lack of coverage in the news about it, there's almost kind of for me, that kind of, it gets to the heart of what privilege really is. If you have the luxury of being able to scroll past that story without thinking that it applies to you, without imagining somebody that you love in that situation in Chris Cabba's place, without worrying about how you're going to talk to your kids about it, without worrying about what it means for your family's future relationship with law enforcement, then that is privilege. And I think just kind of recognizing that and recognizing where our experience diverges from other people is really, really key there. And I have a son, but if I choose not to, I don't have to talk to him about this kind of thing. I mean, he's too small to know about it anyway now, but I can choose not to talk to him about it because he won't be on the receiving end of that. But I know that other people aren't that fortunate. And that's where that absence of challenge really comes in.
And I know from we've talked about it before, from my personal point of view, the whole concept of absence of challenge really helped me to think about that concept of privilege, and absence of challenge just really brought it to life for me as well. So I think it's a great way of looking at it. You kind of touched on allyship, and we'll come back to that, but I thought I'm going to throw in the first question that we've had, and please do, the participants out there, please do, feed in your questions on any of these topics as we go through it. And it kind of touches this question on all that you've been talking about around that how to challenge and how to raise your voice. And the question says, how can we re-engage those who have disconnected from the conversation, either because they've been called out and now feel too scared to talk, or because they don't believe their voice belongs in the conversation anymore?
Such a good question. It's a really good question. I kind of feel like maybe there's two sort of separate things there. I think, people who are feeling like they've disconnected from the conversation because they've been called out. We hear that so many times, people saying, am I not just opening an enormous can of worms here? By starting these conversations, what if somebody calls me out? What if somebody in my team tells me that they've been really upset or offended by something that I've done? And I think it really kind of comes back to that piece about what Judy said earlier. If somebody has said to you, look, I know that this is probably not how you meant it, but when you said X, Y, Z, this is the impact it had on me. I think, that's a huge privilege in kind of the nicest sense of the word, that someone trusts you enough to know that you're going to do something with that conversation. So I guess I would kind of, with those people who feel like they've disconnected from the conversation, I think I would try and encourage them to really see it as a positive and recognize that as human beings, it's totally natural. Any of us, when we get feedback, there's a really interesting video by a lady called Sheila Heen that we sometimes share with our clients about what happens for us neurologically when we get feedback. And it is almost like our bodies are under attack, because our instinct is to kind of try and find a way to invalidate any kind of negative feedback as it comes towards us. But I think it's, we would really encourage people to kind of think about the positives of that, and the fact that people have felt safe enough to come and share that with them. And that's a big deal, because if somebody shared it with you, that means that they think you're going to do the right thing with it. And I would encourage them from that perspective. Julie, I don't know whether you wanted to kind of handle the second bit, or you want to just keep going.
No, I was just going to add that I give an example, don't I, of when I was kind of called out many, many years ago. Not called out, but someone, and I definitely see it as a gift, someone who's a very, very, very good friend of mine now, called me out, and she is a gay lady, and I'd used the term lesbian. And she just pulled me aside and said, oh, just so you know, I really don't like the term lesbian. I much prefer to be, gay lady is what I choose. And I must admit, I was mortified because we were getting, becoming friends, and I thought I'd upset her, and I work in this space. But actually, I'm so delighted that she felt comfortable enough to say that to me. It was a tiny, I thought I was using the right term. And she corrected me, and I changed it, and that's absolutely fine. We're really great friends. And it's another example, it's not being called out or doing something really, really awful, but it's the sort of thing where some people would say, oh, I used the wrong term, therefore I will never talk about any of this stuff ever again because I got it wrong. And we absolutely encourage you to please keep having the conversation. That if someone says to you, please use this word, not the other one, just use that. And also be aware that, you have 100 people in a room, they probably would all prefer a different term, no matter what the characteristic is. Maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but yeah, people like prefer to use slightly different words, slightly different labels, slightly different terms. And so please don't take it as a personal attack, like we said, and get defensive. Just absolutely take it as a gift, as I did, after I got over the moment of being a little bit embarrassed, and move on with it. Yeah. And to the second point, if I recall correctly, it was about if someone then feels they don't have a voice in a conversation.
Their voice doesn't belong in the conversation anymore because they feel too scared to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's really tough. And I'm definitely interested to hear what you would say, Trish, because we do this all the time, and we kind of get into the detail of exactly what that might mean. Like, let's talk about the scenario, what happened. Let's talk that through. But fundamentally, I'd say that if it's you as an individual, your voice is valid. Absolutely, we cannot say enough how. Be brave enough to have a conversation, please. If it's you as an individual that feels you've been kind of excluded or shut down or quietened, then don't do that. Step back up and please share your thought. If you're someone who you feel you're trying to kind of draw somebody back into a conversation, if you feel that someone's disengaged and you'd like them back in, then I guess it's, as Trish said before, it's that just being open and honest and saying, I'd noticed that you haven't contributed to the conversation since X, or I noticed you haven't, I'd really be interested if you have an opinion, if you have something to say, and just, revalidate that their perspective, their contribution and whatever they have to say for the conversation is important. We talk a lot, again, in the work we do about equality of voice. And it's really key to having this inclusive culture where everyone should be able to say their piece, have a chance to say their piece. But Trish, you may have much more to add.
No, I was just thinking about again, another conversation that we've had in the last couple of weeks with one of our clients, where we were talking about this, in terms of there was some nervousness voiced by people to say, well, I'm just worried that, what about, the example they used was the straight white dudes, what about those guys? Because we're having all these conversations. How do we make sure that people who are part of a powerful group in society don't feel like they're being left out of this conversation or feel like they're being alienated? And I think it's, for us, the point is always around recognizing that a really diverse workforce, kind of right back to what Julie said at the beginning of this conversation, a really diverse workforce brings something so different and so rich to every conversation, and kind of having those discussions about what inclusion feels for everybody, because regardless of who we are and regardless of what elements our identities have, I think everybody can relate to feeling excluded at some point. We can all kind of tap into something from our past or from our memories of a time where we felt really uncomfortable, or whether we felt excluded from a conversation. So I think talking about it in those terms, in a way of, how can we all do something here that's going to make things different, and really kind of recognizing that difference is really good for all of us. And we see that our team might be quite small, but we have kind of a real broad range of perspectives and experiences within our team, and I think we're much better for that richness in terms of the creativity that's sparked by having those different perspectives in the room. So I think I would kind of be inclined to make sure that it is a conversation that applies to everybody within an organisation or within a team. And what one of our lovely clients, fabulous overachieving clients, was saying yesterday, that within their part of the organisation, they had literally got everybody together, so kind of all 80 people that fall under them in this organisation, and had talked about, what does it mean for us to be inclusive, and how does that benefit all of us? And I think when we're talking about it in those terms, it's much more difficult for people to feel alienated by the conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you. Great answers and great question for whoever posed that one. Please do continue keeping those questions coming in and add to the richness of this conversation. We started talking about allyship. We mentioned allyship, and I said I was going to come back to that. So, what can people do? You talked about the kind of power of being that ally. What can people do to really become great allies in communities that they're not actually necessarily part of?
I think educate them, do the work. We always say this sort of like, do the work. And by doing the work, we mean educate yourself first and foremost. And don't expect that the people who form part of maybe the marginalized group that you want to kind of learn about, don't expect them to educate you. That's, you know, back to what you said earlier, Herbie, about conversations being tiring or exhausting. It's definitely tiring and exhausting if you're the one person in the office everyone goes to learn about, I don't know, neurodiversity. So educate yourselves and don't make assumptions. And actually that links me back to what we were just talking about. I wanted to make a point about not making assumptions. You know, the work that we do most days, we have to kind of make sure we remind people, as I said at the beginning, that diversity is not just about protected characteristics, but also it's so much of it is non-visible. You can't make assumptions at all about, you know, what, you know, someone, what characteristics someone might have when you're talking about true diversity. And the piece that someone referenced yesterday in our clients about, you know, white straight dude, is like, yes, but all the other aspects of the characteristics that might fall into, you know, a marginalized group, you know, should also be considered. And you can't just assume just because they look the same. But yes, to your point, it's educate yourself and not put that burden on somebody else. I'm a huge fan in this instance of social media. I don't usually do social media, but I found it incredibly enlightening and empowering to use social media to learn about other people's perspectives. So in my case, around neurodiversity, which was kind of a new topic, I've read, you know, the medical books and journals and things. And I guess, as we said, I get the concept intellectually, but to kind of apply a human aspect or some of my emotion to the topic, where I follow social media and people who are neurodiverse and talk about, you know, how that manifests for them, what exacerbates situations, how they can kind of minimize their symptoms, so to speak, how they can kind of set up, how they have a structure to their day, what works for them, basically. It's been hugely educational and enlightening, and I've really found that helpful. So I'd encourage people to use things like that to educate themselves. You know, it's back to what we said at the beginning, becoming familiar with things that are unfamiliar, so therefore they're not scary. So anything you kind of don't really understand or know about, read about that, look that up, watch a new TV program, read a different newspaper. All of the above is a really good way to educate yourself. And the second key thing, I guess, is the piece around challenging that we have talked about, but it's challenging anything that just doesn't feel quite right, you don't think is right. And that's not just the example we gave, I guess, of challenging an individual, although that does count. But speak up about anything, processes, procedures. You know, again, a massive part of the work we do is around recruitment and attrition. And it's look at that stuff and think about, well, is this inclusive? Does this mean that we have, you know, we're attracting the widest pool of candidates? Are we alienating anyone at the first hurdle because we said they need to be somewhere specific tomorrow morning who can't do that? And yeah, just kind of, as much as possible, as we referred to earlier, start to kind of almost practice looking at things with that lens of inclusivity. Does this work for everybody? I know it kind of works for me, but if I was X, Y, or Z, would this work in the same way? Would this be accessible in the same way? And some of the things we talk to people about, if it's not kind of, you know, a microaggression necessarily, but it's just a situation that doesn't feel right, you can just ask open questions to people. So how did you come to that decision? You know, what evidence might you have had that led you to think that? In kind of a non-confrontational way, you can kind of challenge situations or people just by asking those kind of questions, and just to hear the answer, or to kind of hopefully for that light bulb to go on for the other people in the room. Trish, would you add anything to
I
this?
think just echoing what you were saying about, it doesn't need to be just about challenging individuals. I think, we have to recognise that a lot of the structures that are in place in organisations are also kind of, I suppose, flawed or biased or whatever you want to say, because they've been created by people who have their own perspectives on this stuff. So, Julie obviously gave the example of the recruitment side of things, but I think, we always talk about the fact that progression and promotion is equally, if not more important than recruitment. And quite often we'll have things in place because that's how they've always been. So we'll say, oh, if you want to be the most senior person in the organisation to get promoted to that level, you have to work full time. Or we want people who are kind of really able to kind of shout about their achievements. And, it's kind of almost shorthand for, we're kind of recruiting in the mold of the people who are already there, or we're progressing and promoting in the mold of people already there. And I think sometimes if we just kind of take it back, as Julie said, to really objectively, like, what are we actually trying to achieve here? So, if we say that someone needs to be really, really good at shouting about their achievements to get to this particular level in the organisation, why are we saying that? Is it because it makes our life easier in terms of making that decision? Or is it because a key part of that role is being able to shout about your achievements? And if we say that these very senior roles are full-time, is it because they actually, do we actually need people to be 5 days a week full-time in those roles? Or is it because that's the way it's always been and that feels a bit more comfortable for us? So I think just kind of questioning some of those structures that are in place is really, really important as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. And the so just kind of moving on, another, again, answering some of the questions that we've got, and we've talked about, you're talking there again about the microaggressions and the challenge around those, and we've talked about it being an emotive subject and can be very uncomfortable. So what would your advice be? I know you talked, Julie, about the situation you were in, but what would the two of you, your advice be if someone has been told they've said something wrong, has maybe been accused of being microaggressive? How can people manage that situation, that emotion? What would your advice be?
I think that for me, the most important thing is kind of recognizing that whatever is going on in that moment, it's not about you, it's about how somebody has received this. So I think kind of, whilst it will be really, really tough to do, ignore any instinct to kind of try and deny it, say that's not how you meant it, any of those kind of things, because I think that's really, that's probably the initial reaction that most of us would have. We've all been in that situation, whether it's something specific like this, or whether it's just a kind of, I don't know, an argument with a partner or a child at home, where your kind of first instinct is to go, no, you're wrong. I think kind of really hearing what people say is really important, and recognizing, I think, the difference between intent and impact in those situations. So I would say 9 times out of 10, as Julie said earlier, when someone has inadvertently made a microaggression, they're not doing it on purpose, they're not doing it with negative intention. We had a lot of conversations about banter in the workplace, and how one person's banter is another person's microaggression, is another person's outright discrimination. So I think just kind of recognizing that the difference between what you intended with something and the impact that it has is really important, and taking that feedback and thanking the person for sharing that with you, and then going away and understanding a bit more about it. I think, your example earlier, Julie, about your friend who prefers to be gay lady rather than lesbian, that's around her personal preference, but also terminology and language moves on so quickly. You may say something that was acceptable last year and now people don't use anymore. So I think kind of going in and educating yourself, Google is our friend in this situation, kind of going and Googling those terms and finding out why they might be not okay for people is really helpful as well. But I think the most important thing to do is to recognize, as Julie said earlier, feedback is a gift. Thank you for sharing that with me, and apologizing for the impact that you've had is really important.
I think just adding that, interesting that last phrase you said, because another question has come in, which is an interesting one. So what does a good apology look like?
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. I suppose I always kind of just go with being really sincere about it. that's, for me, that's the most important thing. Please don't, I've had this myself in the last couple of months where in a voluntary role that I was doing, I had an enormous amount of grief from somebody, and they came up after the meeting was finished and said, "I'm sorry if I offended you." And I mean, firstly, that isn't an apology, but, you know, kind of, I think say sorry if kind of puts the blame back on the person who is upset or offended, or in my case, bawling my eyes out. It's very important to be vulnerable in these situations, isn't it? So it's kind of, you know, it's not kind of sorry if it's I'm sorry that this is what I did. I think that's the really important thing, kind of being completely sincere about it and recognizing the impact that your actions or your words have on somebody else is really important. And I think if you're, you know, if you're in that kind of situation where it is something about microaggression, kind of, if you do decide that you're going to go and do some Googling and understand a bit more about the language, then going back to somebody and saying thank you afterwards for the heads up that they've given you is also really powerful once you've, you know, once you've done that work and, you know, understand it a bit better. Julie?
Yeah, no, I agree absolutely with everything you've said. I was just thinking about some scenarios we've worked through with clients where if someone's, I guess it was more the sort of management and the leadership. So if someone's come to you and used an example and said something else has happened with somebody else. So I guess you as a manager, you know, a person comes to you and says, my peer has done X, Y, and Z. So you're not necessarily apologizing because it's not you that's done it. It's come up a lot with you know, us saying, let's have these conversations, ask people what they need, and managers like, but what, I don't know what to give them. And so we would say, you know, listen to what the person has to say in the same way as Tricia said in this example. You can show empathy for how someone feels without, you know, necessarily understanding the other side of the situation, and not feeling like you need to have the answer to everything. So something we share often is, you know, having a conversation, listening, showing empathy to them feeling really bad about this, showing sincerity and trying to make the situation better, but just maybe saying something like, what would be a comfortable next step? Let's agree a comfortable next step is a really nice way to kind of, you know, say, I don't have the answer right now, but I will do something about it. But I absolutely want you to be part of that conversational journey. I'm not just going to go off and fix this on your behalf. And that seems to be a really tried and tested way of managing a situation. If you're, as I say, a manager that's kind of, or someone in power, who's being approached to try and kind of make something better on somebody else's behalf.
Yeah, no, thank you. And we talked about another question. You've talked a lot about educating yourself when it talks to allyship, and you've talked about the kind of, you know, the useful outlets like Google, etc. Is there anything else that you can touch on that? Because the question is around, where do I start if I want to educate myself? So what other hints and tips could you give?
We're smiling. Our website, Educate Yourself. There's a section I pretty much called Educate Yourself, which is, I think, a really good starting place. But I can't take credit at all, actually, because it was our amazing Trish and our amazing comms team. But I would say that's a really good place to start to kind of, yeah, get some nuggets, and then maybe you can then see more terminology, and then you can Google or search around that. We've created a page where you can kind of click on the topic you'd like. So informational, and click how much time you can spend, 10 minutes, half an hour, and it will then give you some, at least a starter for 10 in that area.
We're also going to pop up on the website page, which was hosting the details of this webinar. We're going to pop up some suggestions for kind of further reading, further watching, further listening. I can't take credit for this either. It's our marvelous Gigi, our comms and creative consultant, who is a kind of a great way to educate yourself is whilst sitting on your sofa, eating popcorn and just watching something different. So there's so many amazing shows out there on all sorts of different channels. It's another one of the amazing things about the world that we live in now, that there is all this richness of stories out there really at our fingertips. So we'll share some really good ones there, because I think when it comes to educating ourselves, thinking about, I guess, you know, what parts of our identity kind of diverge from other people. So you know, if we don't have experience of being a trans person, then is there something that we can go and kind of watch or read or listen to that would give us some of that insight and kind of broaden out our bubbles a little bit. There's some amazing, really powerful documentaries and dramas around race as well that you can get on Netflix that we'll share with you. So I think just kind of some of that's kind of a nice easy way to do it. It's not always an easy watch, but kind of, you know, in terms of the effort that you have to put in, you can kind of just sit on your sofa and watch or listen to those. And also some amazing podcasts on various different channels. I mean, every time I Google, I seem to kind of come up with something different. So we'll share some of those recommendations after this session as well, back on the website.
Right, thank you. And you know, it's great to have that variety, isn't it? Because people learn in different ways, people connect in different ways. So the listening to podcasts, viewing something, reading something, everyone's got their different preferences. To have that variety is a great way of providing that information. Another question, going back to the topic and back to the subject of unconscious bias. The government has said recently that unconscious bias training isn't worth doing. What's your thinking on that?
The short answer is we disagree. I think this probably comes from the report that came out last year, and I think we pretty much disagreed with everything that was contained within that report, but that's another story. I think specifically on this point around unconscious bias training, I think we really don't like that word, the word training, because you cannot train people to be inclusive. You can't train them to be unbiased. So I think, you know, maybe if they're thinking you can't do a click through, you know, the kind of things that we've all been forced to do in corporate environments, you know, click through a online session where you have to answer 3 questions at the end and get told whether you're biased or not. Yes, there probably is limited value in that. But is there value in understanding the concept of bias and how it applies to our workplace? We don't think that you can have a truly inclusive environment if people aren't aware that they have biases. So yes, we disagree with the government on that one. Anything to add, Julie?
Everything you said. Yeah, and it's why I guess we've, you know, I feel like I'm a broken record, said it over and over again, but in the work we do, we don't refer to it as training because we don't feel, you know, say that to us is that kind of, you know, watching a screen and clicking buttons, and as much interaction as possible is best if you're out there looking maybe for unconscious bias training. Not saying it needs to be us, but making it, having a conversation, as you said before, and having interactive sessions where you share opinions, experiences, etc. Is, we would say, the best way to do this, and it's really, really powerful. So yes, totally disagree. It's a really important concept to have to get your heads around and to explore more, definitely.
Great, thank you. Right, so we're 3 minutes from time, so I don't think we have any time for any more questions, but thank you for those of you who did pose the questions. So really, it's just for me to thank you again, all of you, for attending. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Trish and Julie, for all of your commentary, all of the views. Please do keep the connection. I'm sure Julie and Trish would welcome any further conversations beyond this webinar, and, you know, absolutely connect in with the website and look at all the education that's on there. Listen out for any future podcasts, etc., and blogs that I'm sure will be coming on these topics. So maybe Trish, just to leave you, is there any final last messages you want to give as part of this webinar?
Big thank you to you, Herbie, for being such a wonderful host. We very much appreciated it. We'll hopefully persuade you back for another one at some point in the future. We'd really love to hear from any of our attendees today if they've got any topics that they'd like to hear about for our next webinar, which will be at some point in the next quarter. So we've had a lovely time doing this today. Thank you so much for facilitating, Herbie. Thank you for joining us, to our participants, and thank you for a lovely conversation, Julie.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.